Is God really three co-equal and distinct persons? Or is God really one? Well, what did Isaiah the prophet say about it? In Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 25, to whom then will you liken me, or shall I be equal, saith the Holy One? Well, the Holy One there asked the question, to whom then will you liken me, or shall I be equal? So if there are three co-equal and distinct persons in God, then the God of the Bible didn't know anything about it, did he? He said there was no such thing. There in Isaiah 40, verse 25, he said that there are none equal to him. And then the one speaking calls himself the Holy One. So I think that we can rule out the fact that there are co-equal persons with God. Now, how about distinct? Let's focus in on distinct a little bit, because Trinitarianism says that there are three co-equal persons of God, and that they're all distinct from each other, meaning that they're not the same. Well, let's see what the Apostle Paul had to say about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And starting in verse 4, Paul says, now there are diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. So he's talking about the gifts of the Spirit, and he says, but they're of the same Spirit. Then, verse 5, there are differences of administrations, but the same Lord. Okay, now they would say, Trinitarians, that the Spirit is one distinct person of God, and the Lord is another distinct person of God. And Paul says here in verse 4, there's diversities of gifts, but the same Spirit. Verse 5, differences of administrations, but the same Lord. So he's indicating that the Spirit and the Lord are the same. Then verse 6, there are diversities of operations, but it is the same God which worketh all in all. So now Trinitarians say that there are three co-equal and distinct persons of God. They would say the Spirit and the Lord, which is Jesus, and God, which they would say is the Father. And they would say that these three are distinct from each other. But we see here that Paul didn't write anything about them being distinct. He says here that they are the same. You know, the same is opposite of distinct. So did Paul believe that the Lord and the Spirit and God were the same? Well, look at verse 11 there in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul says, but all these worketh that one and the self same Spirit, dividing to every man severally as he will. So Paul says nothing about distinct persons of God, does he? Matter of fact, he says there in verse 11 that there's one and the self same Spirit. One, meaning one, not three, and the self same Spirit. See, when Paul here is talking about God and the Lord and the Spirit, he calls them the same. So if he's calling them the same, they're not distinct God persons. So that's what we want to drive home in this little video, is that there are not three God persons. There must be another way to describe, obviously, the oneness of God than distinct God persons. So stay tuned, and we'll continue to show how that there is another way. Praise the Lord.